The bathroom light hummed, a thin, electrical buzz that filled the small space. Sarah stared at the plastic stick resting on the porcelain edge. 2 pink lines. They were clear, absolute, and impossible to ignore. Her hands began to tremble, a fine, rhythmic vibration that traveled from her fingertips to her shoulders. She reached for the test, but her grip failed. It clattered against the plastic rim of the trash can and disappeared into the shadows inside. She stood frozen. The walls of the room seemed to lean inward, narrowing the space until the air felt heavy and thick. She pressed her palms against the cool vanity, trying to steady her breathing, but the rhythm of her heart pushed against her ribs. She turned away, pushed the door open, and stepped into the hallway. The house was unnervingly still. No clocks ticked. No wind moved through the vents. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, pressing her hands into the fabric as if to hold herself together. Every step toward the living room felt like walking through deep water. The silence of the house pressed against her ears, a suffocating weight that turned every breath into a conscious, difficult effort. She looked at the front door, then at the darkened kitchen, realizing the path ahead had vanished. The school hallway stretched out like a gauntlet. Sarah stepped through the heavy double doors, her pulse jumping against her throat. The morning air felt sharp, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. She kept her head low, eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum tiles. Then, the sound began. It started as a low, jagged murmur, like static on a radio, rising as she moved toward her locker. Heads turned in unison. A group of classmates huddled near the water fountain stopped their conversation, their eyes tracking her movement with cold, clinical precision. As she walked past, they physically pivoted, turning their backs to create a wall of indifference. She heard the distinct, sharp intake of breath, followed by a flurry of hushed comments that trailed her like smoke. She tightened her grip on her backpack straps until her knuckles turned white, the plastic biting into her shoulders. Every step felt heavier than the last. She tried to find a familiar face, but the path ahead was a sea of averted gazes. The space around her seemed to warp and shrink, leaving her in a small, isolated circle of silence amidst the noise of the crowd. She reached her locker, fumbled with the dial, and heard the metallic click of the lock, but the surrounding whispers only grew louder, cutting through the morning routine like a blade. The hallway was only the beginning. Days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of averted eyes and muffled laughter that followed her into the sanctuary of the classroom. She claimed the desk in the back corner, the one where the light never reached. She sat with her notebook open, but the pages remained blank, the paper stark and white against the dim wood. She watched the clock on the wall. The second hand ticked with a mechanical, mocking rhythm, marking time she felt she had already lost. When classmates passed her desk, they widened their stride as if her presence were a contagion. She kept her chin tucked against her chest, her breath shallow and rhythmic. She stared at the grain of the desk, tracing the scratches in the varnish with a fingernail until the skin turned raw. The teacher's voice at the front of the room became a dull, meaningless drone, a sound that existed in another world entirely. She dropped her pen. It rolled under the desk, but she did not reach for it. She let it stay there, abandoned. The weight of the silence in the room finally broke her. She looked up, her vision blurring at the edges, and the words slipped out, barely audible against the hum of the air vents. "My life is over." She let the truth of it settle into her bones, the finality of the sentence mirroring the stillness of the room. The desk felt cold against her palms. Sarah kept her gaze locked on the floor, watching a speck of dust dance in a sliver of sunlight. The classroom had emptied for the break, leaving only the sound of her own uneven breathing. Then, the floorboards creaked. A shadow stretched across her notebook, darkening the blank page. Mr. Miller pulled out the chair across from her, the metal legs scraping harshly against the linoleum. He did not look at her with pity. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk, and waited until she finally looked up. "What is your next move?" The question hung in the air, stripped of judgment. Sarah blinked, the sudden clarity of the inquiry startling her. She raised a hand, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and let out a shaky, jagged breath. She whispered, "My life is over." Mr. Miller did not flinch. He reached into his bag, pulled out a worn, leather-bound book, and slid it across the surface until it hit her notebook. "Circumstances are just noise, Sarah. Your response is the music. Decisions define you, not the situation. He stood up, leaving the book between them. Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing the spine of the volume, and for the first time that day, the crushing weight in her chest shifted. The classroom fell into a heavy, expectant quiet. Sarah stared at the worn book, then turned her focus to the blank notebook. She uncapped her pen, the plastic clicking sharp in the stillness. Her hand stopped shaking. She pressed the tip into the paper, the ink flowing dark and deliberate. At the very top, she wrote health in bold, heavy strokes. Below it, she listed education, family, and goals. Each word was a stake in the ground. She turned the page. The fear that had paralyzed her for weeks was still there, but she didn't look at it. She drew a thick black line through the center of the page, physically striking out the doubt. In the space beneath, she began to draft a schedule. 6 months, every hour accounted for. She mapped out the mornings, the afternoons, and the nights. She set times for rest, times for study, and times for work. The frantic, spiraling energy of her mind condensed into a rigid, manageable grid. She checked the clock. The second hand no longer mocked her. It was a tool, and she was finally using it. She closed the notebook with a decisive snap. The silence of the room no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a workspace. She stood up, the chair scraping the floor, and walked toward the exit with her gaze fixed on the door. At 5 in the morning, the house was a tomb of shadows. Sarah sat at the small kitchen table, the light from a single lamp pooling over her textbooks. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic scratching of her pen. Her eyelids burned from lack of sleep, but she did not stop. When the sun began to bleed through the curtains, she closed the book and reached for her bag. The cafe shift was relentless. For 4 hours, she moved between tables, carrying heavy trays and cleaning spills. Her feet ached with every step, and the constant motion left her muscles trembling. By noon, the exhaustion felt like lead in her veins. She retreated to the back room, her breath coming in shallow gasps, the urge to collapse weighing heavily on her. She reached into her bag and pulled out the notebook. She scanned the list she had written the night before. Study, complete. Shift, complete. She picked up her pen. Her hand moved with a slow, deliberate strength as she drew a check mark next to the final item. The ink looked sharp against the page. It was a tiny, silent victory, but it was enough to pull her upright. She straightened her back, exhaled, and walked back out onto the floor. The world outside her home remained jagged. At the grocery store, the whispers were not loud, but they were intentional. She felt the eyes of neighbors tracking her path through the aisles. A group of classmates huddled near the registers, their sneers sharp and visible. In the past, she would have tucked her chin and stared at her boots. Now, she kept her head level. She walked directly past them, her pace steady, forcing them to be the ones to look away. At the library, the silence was often broken by hushed comments. She ignored them, pulling her heavy textbooks onto the table with a firm, audible thud. She took her prenatal vitamins with a glass of water, the ritual calm and unhurried. Her life had become a dual pursuit of survival and knowledge. Between chapters on history and biology, she stood in the quiet corners of the stacks, practicing her speech. She repeated phrases aloud, lowering her pitch, smoothing out the jagged edges of her nerves. Her voice grew resonant, losing its tremor with every syllable. She was no longer hiding. She was preparing. She marked another task in her notebook, closed the cover, and stood up. The weight she carried was not just the books in her bag, but the growing momentum of her own resolve. The gymnasium hummed with a low, collective vibration. Hundreds of people sat in the bleachers, a sea of faces that had once turned away. Sarah stood in the wings, the diploma heavy in her right hand. Beside her, a small weight pressed against her hip, a steady reminder of the 2 lives she had carried to this finish line. The principal called her name. The noise in the room shifted. A sudden, sharp silence replaced the murmurs. She moved forward. The floorboards creaked under her weight. She walked toward the center of the stage, her stride measured and deliberate. She did not look at the floor. She did not hunt for a place to hide. She reached the podium, took the scroll, and turned to face the crowd. The eyes that had once held judgment now held a stunned, quiet recognition. She held the diploma high, then shifted her grip to keep her child steady. Every step she had taken, every early morning, and every sneer she had endured had led to this singular point of gravity. The air in the room felt thin, charged with the shift in her reality. She walked off the stage, her head held high, the transition from girl to woman solidified in the solid, rhythmic thud of her footsteps against the wood. The door to the classroom pushed open with the same familiar groan. The air inside smelled of dry paper and old dust, a scent that pulled years of memory into the present. Sarah stepped across the threshold, her movements fluid and unhurried. She walked past the empty rows of desks where she had once sat in silence, hiding behind blank pages and lowered eyes. The room was empty, save for the man at the front. Mr. Miller sat at his station, a pen poised over a stack of graded papers. He did not look up immediately. Sarah reached the front of the room. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a crisp embossed business card, and laid it firmly on the wood of his desk. The card made a sharp, clean sound as it hit the surface. Mr. Miller paused. He shifted his gaze from the papers to the card, reading the name printed there. Then he looked at Sarah. The weight of the past hung in the space between them, but it was no longer a burden. "My life was not over," she said, her voice steady and resonant, filling the quiet room. Mr. Miller leaned back, a slow recognition crossing his features. "It was just the prologue," he replied. The statement settled into the air, final and absolute, turning the pages of the past into the foundation of her present. Sarah turned away from the desk. She walked toward the window that overlooked the schoolyard. This was the same patch of dirt where she had once stood in the shadows, hoping to vanish. She looked down at the concrete. The cracks were still there, the weeds still pushed through the edges, but the perspective had shifted. The weight she had carried for so long, the fear, the doubt, the long nights of study, had not broken her. It had forged her. Every struggle had been a resistance exercise for her spirit. She felt the tension in her shoulders release, replaced by a steady, grounding strength. She moved to the door, pressed her palm against the metal, and pushed it open. The outside air hit her face, crisp and clear. She stepped onto the pavement. The light spilled over the yard, illuminating the path ahead. She did not look back. She walked toward the edge of the school grounds, her stride purposeful and light. The past was a fixed point, a chapter closed. The future was open, a broad horizon she had built with her own hands. She stepped into the full intensity of the afternoon sun, no longer a girl hiding from a mistake, but a woman walking toward her own design.